Here is what the headline says. And here is what the headline is not explaining, which is the part that actually determines what happens next. The headline says, every United States president makes the same mistake. That framing suggests failure at the level of individual leadership. It suggests poor judgment, flawed decision-making, or personal weakness. That framing is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that changes the meaning entirely. This is not a report about presidential mistakes. This is a report about a system in which the outcome is already structured before the decision is made. Let me tell you what this actually is. In 1961, Dwight Eisenhower, not a theorist, not a commentator, but the supreme Allied commander of the Second World War, gave a farewell address. In that address, he warned of what he called the military-industrial complex. That phrase is often repeated. It is rarely understood in its full structural meaning. He was not describing a conspiracy. He was describing a system of incentives. 5 players: the president, the Pentagon, defense contractors, Congress, the media. Each of these actors is rational. Each responds to incentives that are visible, measurable, and immediate. And when each actor behaves rationally within those incentives, the collective outcome becomes irrational at the national level. That is the structure. And here is the part of this report that the headline will not tell you, but that determines what the next move is. The system does not require coordination. It does not require agreement. It produces the same outcome even if every participant believes they are acting independently. Let me walk through the decision structure. The president operates on election cycles, 4 years, in practice much shorter. Approval ratings matter immediately. Electoral consequences matter immediately. War produces what is known as the rally around the flag effect, an average increase of 15% in approval ratings. That increase happens quickly. Now consider the cost timeline. The financial cost, the human cost, the strategic cost. These do not appear immediately. They appear 18 to 24 months later. 18 to 24 months. That is often after the next election cycle. So the incentive structure is clear. Immediate political gain, deferred political cost. And the cost is often inherited by the next administration. This is not a theory. This is timing. Now move to the Pentagon. Peace reduces budgets. Peace reduces institutional relevance. War expands both. War produces larger appropriations, greater visibility, and long-term institutional expansion. It also produces secondary incentives, public presence, media exposure, and post-service opportunities. Ask a simple structural question. When was the last time a senior military official argued for reducing military funding? The absence of that argument is not accidental. It is incentive-aligned. Now consider defense contractors. The numbers here are precise. In April 2026, during the Iran war, Raytheon stock increased by 30% in the first month. A single Tomahawk missile costs approximately $2 million to replace after use, $2 million per missile. Multiply that across sustained operations. The incentive is not for rapid resolution. The incentive is for continuity of demand. And there is one data point in today's report that changes how you read everything else. We are going to get to it. But first, Congress. Defense contractors distribute manufacturing across nearly every congressional district. This is deliberate. Lockheed Martin's F-35 program involves components produced in 45 states. 45 states. That is not logistics. That is political architecture. A member of Congress voting against defense spending is not voting on abstract policy. They are voting on jobs in their district, factories, supply chains, employment. And the electoral consequence is immediate. Add to this $100 million in annual lobbying expenditure. Add approximately 40,000 defense industry lobbyists operating in Washington. The result is not subtle. Congress has not seriously debated or restricted a military operation in more than 50 years. The authorization to use military force passed in 2001 remains in effect. 25 years. Same authorization. Now consider the media. In 1991, during the Gulf War, CNN's ratings increased by 300%. That moment revealed something fundamental. War is the most profitable content in news. Explosions, real-time updates, visual narratives, urgency, continuous coverage. The incentive is not to question strategic logic. The incentive is to sustain viewer engagement. The relationship between the military and the media becomes mutually reinforcing. Access is granted to journalists who align with the framing. Critical voices lose access. The information environment shifts. This is not about bias in the conventional sense. It is about access-driven incentives. Let me be very specific about what this is and what it is not. This is not a failure of individual morality. It is not a breakdown of decision-making capacity. It is a system in which rational actors produce an irrational outcome. And here is the quote that frames this entire structure. Rational players can produce irrational collective outcomes. Now consider the sequence. A president faces an election cycle. The Pentagon signals readiness. Contractors align for production. Congress aligns for local economic protection. Media aligns for audience engagement. Each decision is made independently. The outcome is consistent. And the question that this raises, and that the rest of this analysis must answer, is this. If every actor is behaving rationally, where in the system can the outcome actually change? This report is being presented as a pattern of repeated presidential error. That is accurate, but it is missing the structural logic that makes the repetition inevitable, and that logic becomes visible only when you examine how each actor reads the system they are operating within. Let me tell you what this actually is. This is not one decision repeated many times. This is one system producing the same decision, regardless of who occupies the presidency. And here is what the coverage is not explaining. Each participant in this system is not reacting to the same reality. They are reacting to their own incentive structure, and those structures do not align. This is where the analysis shifts from event to interpretation. Let us begin with the president. From the president's perspective, the system is temporal. Time defines the decision. Approval ratings move quickly. Elections arrive quickly. Political vulnerability is immediate. A 15% increase in approval during wartime is not an abstract number. It is the difference between political survival and political defeat. Now place that against the 18 to 24-month delay before costs become visible. The president's reading is straightforward. The benefits are immediate, the costs are delayed, and the delay often extends beyond their own term in office. That is not miscalculation. That is rational timing. Now consider how the Pentagon reads the same situation. The Pentagon does not operate on election cycles. It operates on budget cycles, strategic posture, and institutional relevance. In a state of peace, justification for high levels of expenditure becomes more difficult. In a state of conflict, justification becomes self-evident. War validates the institution's scale. War expands its scope. So when the Pentagon observes the same situation, it does not see political risk. It sees institutional reinforcement. Both readings are internally consistent. They lead to the same outcome. Now move to defense contractors. For contractors, the system is measured in contracts, production cycles, and replacement costs. The example is precise. A Tomahawk missile costs $2 million to replace after use. $2 million per unit. Multiply by sustained deployment. And then consider the April 2026 data point again. A 30% increase in Raytheon stock during the first month of the Iran war. That is not a side effect. That is the incentive signal. The contractor's reading is not about victory or defeat. It is about continuity of production demand. And here is the part of this report that the headline will not tell you, but that determines what the next move is. The incentives do not align toward ending conflict. They align towards sustaining it. Now consider Congress. Congress does not read this as a foreign policy decision. It reads it as a domestic employment decision. 45 states involved in a single defense program. That number matters because it means there is no neutral position. A vote against defense spending is a vote against local industry, against employment, against economic activity within a district. The electoral consequence is immediate. So Congress aligns, not necessarily because of strategic agreement, but because of electoral necessity. And then there is the media. The media's reading is driven by audience behavior. In 1991, the Gulf War produced a 300% increase in CNN ratings. That is not a marginal shift. That is a structural revelation. War attracts attention at a level no other content achieves. So the media system adapts. It prioritizes immediacy, visuals, urgency. It favors access to maintain coverage. It avoids positions that would limit that access. This is not coordination. This is adaptation to incentive. Now, step back. 5 actors, 5 different readings, 1 consistent outcome. Let me be very specific about what this is and what it is not. This is not a system where actors agree on strategy. This is a system where actors agree on behavior because their incentives point in the same direction. And here is where the historical parallel becomes essential. Game theory describes this as the prisoner's dilemma. Each participant, acting in their own rational self-interest, produces a result that is worse for the group than if they had coordinated differently. But coordination is not stable, because deviation carries immediate penalty. Apply this to the presidency. A president who chooses peace breaks the pattern. But breaking the pattern triggers responses from every other actor in the system. The media reframes the decision as weakness. The Pentagon signals concern about readiness or threat perception. Contractors redirect financial support toward political opponents. Congress resists policy alignment. The cost of deviation becomes immediate. Now consider the historical examples provided. Jimmy Carter, no major wars, 1 term, labeled weak. Ronald Reagan, military actions in Grenada, bombing in Libya, Iran-Contra operations, 2 terms. John F. Kennedy, moved toward withdrawal from Vietnam, assassinated in 1963. Each case presents a variation, but the structural pattern is consistent. Deviation from the system produces immediate political vulnerability. And here is the quote that captures this entire dynamic. The system rewards conflict and penalizes restraint. Now, there is one data point in this entire analysis that matters more than all the others, and it is not the approval ratings, not the stock increases, not the lobbying numbers. It is this. The authorization to use military force passed in 2001 remains in effect today. More than 2 decades later, the legal framework for military action has not been fundamentally revisited. That tells you something critical. It tells you that the system is not only self-reinforcing in behavior, it is self-reinforcing in law. And here is the structural consequence that is not being discussed. If the legal, political, economic, and informational systems all align toward the same outcome, then changing leadership does not change the outcome. It only changes the individual making the same decision. And that leads directly to the question that must be answered next. If leadership does not change the outcome, what, if anything, can? Here is what today's report is being interpreted to mean, and here is what it actually changes, which is far more limited and far more precise than the coverage suggests. The common reading is that this pattern reveals a failure of leadership, that presidents repeatedly choose the same path despite historical evidence of its cost. That interpretation leads to a natural conclusion. Different leaders would produce different outcomes. That conclusion does not follow from the structure that has just been described. This changes one thing. It does not change what most people think it changes. What this changes is not the evaluation of individual presidents. It changes the level at which the problem must be understood. Let me tell you what this actually is. This is a shift from a leadership-level explanation to a system-level explanation. If 5 actors, the president, the Pentagon, defense contractors, Congress, and the media, are each responding rationally to their own incentives, then replacing any single actor does not alter the outcome. The incentives remain. The behavior follows. And here is the part of this report that matters most, and that is receiving the least attention. The system does not require failure to produce failure. It produces the same outcome even when every participant is acting competently. That distinction is critical, because it means the repetition is not accidental, it is structural. Let me walk through what this does not change. It does not change the electoral cycle. Presidents will still face immediate political pressure measured in approval ratings and election timelines. The 15% increase during wartime remains part of the decision environment. The 18 to 24-month delay in visible costs remains unchanged. It does not change the Pentagon's incentive structure. Institutional relevance and budgetary scale will continue to be reinforced by active operations rather than by sustained peace. It does not change contractor economics. A $2 million replacement cost per Tomahawk missile remains. The 30% stock increase observed in April 2026 remains a signal to the market. It does not change congressional alignment. Manufacturing spread across 45 states ensures that defense spending remains tied to domestic employment. $100 million in lobbying and 40,000 lobbyists remain part of the legislative environment. It does not change media incentives. The 300% ratings increase observed during the Gulf War established a model that continues to define coverage priorities. None of these variables shift because of a single event. None of them shift because of a single leader. And here is the pattern interrupt. Let me be very specific about what this is and what it is not. This is not a cycle that can be broken by intent alone. Intent exists within the system. Incentives define the system. And when incentives remain constant, outcomes remain predictable. Now consider the longer structural arc. The conclusion presented is not framed as a forecast. It is framed as a pattern observed across time. Rome is referenced as having operated under a similar incentive structure. The implication is not that outcomes are identical. The implication is that systems built on aligned incentives toward expansion or conflict tend to reproduce those outcomes over extended periods. And here is where the analysis becomes precise. The statement is not that the system will produce immediate collapse. The statement is that the system produces decisions that accumulate over time. Each decision is rational in isolation. Each decision is explainable. Each decision follows from incentives that are visible and measurable. But the accumulation of those decisions produces a trajectory. And there is one data point in this report that reframes the entire timeline. More than 50 years without serious congressional restriction on military operations. 50 years. That is not a short-term pattern. That is institutional continuity. And here is the part of this report that the headline will not tell you, but that determines what the next move is. If the system has remained stable across decades, across administrations, across geopolitical shifts, then the question is not why the outcome repeats. The question is where, within that system, change is even possible. Now consider the prisoner's dilemma again. Each actor has an incentive to continue the current behavior because deviation carries immediate cost. The cost is political, institutional, economic, or informational, depending on the actor. So even if every actor recognizes that the collective outcome is suboptimal, the structure prevents coordinated deviation. That is the trap. And here is the quote that captures the entire consequence of this system. Systems do not change because participants understand them. Understanding does not alter incentives. Awareness does not realign structures. So what does today's report actually change? It changes the level of analysis required to understand the outcome. It moves the focus away from individuals and towards structures. It reframes repeated decisions not as repeated mistakes, but as repeated outputs of a consistent system. And here is the remaining question, the one that determines what happens next, and that has not been answered. If every rational path within the system leads to the same outcome, what would it require to change the system itself? Because without that change, the pattern does not need to be predicted. It only needs to be recognized. And the structural conclusion is this: when incentives remain constant, outcomes repeat, regardless of who is making the decision.